of the tape, side 2, we are going to discuss what I have entitled the Venusian Wars. Now I'm sure you, the listener, you'll probably wonder, why should you give any credibility to the new and the startling ideas that we will present within these tapes? Now, I'm not vain enough to imply that all my ideas and facts are perfectly accurate. Now, in future tapes, we'll correct them as they come to light. There'll be those that'll say, where does a farm boy living in the Ozarks come up with all this far-out stuff, and why, and how does he come up with these conclusions? And why has the scientific world not suspected this? But if we get this information in part from the Bible, why has it not been discovered by the religious world? And why have the students of ancient history never understood? Unfortunately, so many of our scientists become so smug with their little pieces of the puzzle, they ignore the great historical record accounts of Venus, and through hundreds of generations, mainly because of the name changes of Venus from Genesis to Revelations, as we just discussed in one of our last tapes, where we tried to point out to the people, and we'll cover it a little more clearly in other tapes, where we show that Venus was also called the altar in ancient times, and it spoke of the horns of the altar. And we find today the scientists, as I've quoted from some of the latest journals, they are perplexed by what they say is two very large structures on the planet, that so-called, that they seem to be emitting large amounts of sulfur continuously onto the outer surface of it. And we say that our scientists have been puzzled for a long time. There seems to be radio emissions that are picked up from the inside. Now we have Bible scholars who have never considered the Bible as a book of science handed down to earthlings by a great space lord, the great creator, the heavenly Father, and the scientists of all the universe. We find that the historians who ignore the biblical account, the scientific connection, all of these fields are interconnected, and they need to be brought together to understand the great preponderance of evidence that we will present and they have overlooked. This is the purpose of these tapes, to unfold the mysteries hidden from us since the very foundations of this world order. This is not a mass condemnation of all scientists and biblical scholars and historians and other fields, too numerous to mention. All we ask is that if you're a reasonable person, to consider the facts that we glean from these different fields and records, and we will allow you to draw your own conclusions. How is it that we as a nation, that we're so divided in our opinions? Before we get into the meat of the subject of the Venusian Wars, let's examine some of the background of what has caused great confusion and has split the religious world and the scientists. This caused our children to grow up believing in nothing more than sex and materialism, and to become an oversexed yuppie generation, because they have not been presented with the truth of the science and the Bible. And so we present this and hope that there will be a generation who will consider these facts in a new light, because I believe that they're out there. I believe we have a very intelligent generation that has open access to all different types of keys and learning that no other generation for would say centuries or millenniums has had access to. Now, if we were giving out BS degrees, as in fertilizer, we'd have to start over 100 years ago with a man named Darwin. I would automatically give him a BS degree, and those scientists who flocked to his side, hoping to share in his thunder, or the foul-smelling wind that was brought forth by his new movement that spread over the globe like wildfire. I feel that within the last quarter century of my researching scriptures in their relation to history and archaeology and so forth, it qualifies me to speak on this subject. Yet I have to confess I'm not a qualified scientist, but hoping that there are some experts out there who will consider the crumbs of evidence that I will present to them within the confines of these tapes, and that they will make their judgments after examining the facts. This is all I ask, is give me a fair trial. Why should they not consider this? Because since 1858, when Darwin came out with his theory of evolution, he was not a scientist. He did not have any degrees. He did not have any professional training or laboratory. But he had all of these scientists rushing to his side, accepting his theory. Just what was it? It was a theory, my friends. A theory means something that is unproven. Now, those that are aware that if you accept this theory, you have to reject the books of the Bible, which we prove give the account of plant and animal life and human life being brought here from outer space. I think we've well documented these facts. And so if they're great scientists, why do they limit the greatest scientists of all of the universe? Now, the religious world as a whole, they have presented the mystical argument that a great spook God created people out of clouds or clods of dirt here on this earth. They ignore the great preponderance of evidence of, as we find it from cover to cover, that mankind was transported here from outer space. So it appears that the scientific and the religious world have both been wrong, forgetting that the laws handed down to the first records of the Adamic man, that they were brought here from outer space. Now, common sense makes you wonder why some of the monkeys are still in the trees and some of them made it to Wall Street. In a book that was written about Darwin that referred to him as an amateur who did not work in a laboratory or teach in a university, his work was done in his own home without a trained staff and very little fossil equipment. Thus we see that all the later Johnny-come-latelys adherents of this evolution, they were mostly eminent scientists who were in truth only following the theory of an amateur. Unskilled in academic terms, non-professional with an untrained mind, comparison with the later experts and so-called self-appointed authorities who took on his basic idea with the fervor of great zealots. Now, Darwin's 131-year-old theory, it started in 1858, and we find that a friend of Darwin by the name of Alfred R. Wallace, now he resided in East India. He wrote a very devastating letter to Darwin, saying that he had developed some concepts of natural selection. That is, after long thoughts and observation on the theory of evolution, thus examining, or I would say this is a contradiction. There's a great contradiction between the order of natural selection and this evolution theory. Now, here we have Wallace thinking that he alone, he discovered the hidden grand scheme of evolution. At the time, Darwin thinking that he was the only one that gave birth to this new bastardized concept to the world of science. Darwin was going to drop out, but his friend convinced him to present his papers on the new theory. It was finally resolved between the two friends that they would both present their papers on the subject of the Linnean Society of London. They were published simultaneously in the Society's Transactions of 1858. Now, for different reasons, Wallace's work was forgotten and Darwin was created as the father of evolution. Now, Velikovsky had this to say about the theory of evolution. Most controversial is the evolutionary question. I've done a great deal of work on Darwin, and I can say with some assurance that Darwin did not derive his theories from nature, but rather from superimposed a certain philosophical worldwide view on nature, and then he spent the next 20 years trying to gather the facts in order to make his outrageous claims stick. Now, some of the major denominations, they're trying to teach the 21st century people that the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they stepped off the ark, and the supposed three Semitic people, and Ham becoming the father of the black race, and Japheth the father of the yellow race, disregarding historical facts, disregarding genetics, and the Bible states that kind begets like kind. Now, Shem is the only son whose gene pool stayed true to his race, they would have us believe. So many people in all of the different fields, they delude themselves into believing that their little part of knowledge is the sum total of the whole. We find that the very sad part is that the different races, if we go along with this religious theory, they have no identity of their own, according to these religious teachings, causing them to forget their history and their culture. And as we have stated before, the Bible seems to tell us that it alludes to 5 original races referred to in scriptures, and in the ancient idiom of that day, they were referred to as sheep nations, goat nations, hog nations, dog nations, and serpent people. Now, we said in the past chapters that I believe that the rivers that were coming out of the garden, that was an ancient allegory. In that ancient etymology of the language, it represented 4 different racial streams that were to flow out of the heavenly area that were called the trees of the garden. We found that the Adam kind and the Eve kind, they were told that they could go into the trees of the garden and that they could take the fruit of these trees, ancient symbology of racial trees and family trees. But then it spoke of a certain tree that they were not to touch. It said, if you do, you will die. And we find that the command of the Almighty to the ancient Adamic people, later known as Israelites and Hebrews and many other names that they took upon themselves as they traversed this globe, they were told that they were not to mix with anybody outside of their ancestry. And so I did not write the book. This is what this great Lord of space commanded and handed down to his children. So, as we quoted Sitzen from his book, The 12th Planet, his claim is that there were originally 12 planets, and he stated that there were races who preceded the Adam man, which we will sum up dispelling the theory of evolution, and this erroneous theory that 3 white boys gave birth to all of the races that we now have upon this earth. Then we say that some of them came from planets among the stars or in another galaxy. To a lot of the religious world to have a mindset on this that won't open up their mind and analyze the possibility of new truth. We ask you to bear with us. You're probably asking, where is the archaeological evidence of 5 original races, and has one of them disappeared due to wars or famine or cross-breeding or possibly all of the above? Now, there's been more than one writer about the ancient, who has written about the ancient awesome ruins of Tiwanaku. Archaeological authorities agree that it is one of Latin America's greatest archaeological discoveries. They all agree that there has been an empire of dim antiquity before the Incas. We find when the Spanish they arrived in the 1500s, they asked the oldest living Incas, who were these ancient people? Who were they? And they said that they had no idea. And it was found there that they find representations there of many different races of men carved on stone projections from a wall there as you enter in through the gate of what they call the sun god. I would like to stop for just 1 second and present, this is a little off the wall maybe, but here is something to consider. I believe that if we can just get some intelligent people who are more skilled and better trained in this, who will open their mind and say, is there a possibility to what this man speaks of? I believe that we will find in Peru that there is a possibility that it is actually the cradle of civilization. Why was it? Even way back before the Incas, and they don't know how far back. Here is traces of, as we spoke of before, of the Negroid type man, Asiatic man, the white man, all the different races and sub-races, you might say, those that crossbred, creating a new type of race, why are they all represented there? And as we said before, that Solomon, that he got his gold from these mysterious ancient Phoenicians. Now, another thing that a lot of people have not considered, and it just came to me most recently, we find this Tiwanaku. It is a very short distance from, I think, 10 miles from places called Lake Titicaca. Now let's examine that name and wonder why would they call the lake Titicaca. Now, in the ancient language, as it's broken down, it means the holy caca. Now, it means the holy rock. My friends, let's stop and digress for just one moment and stop and think. When the pilgrims of Europe crossed the great oceans to what was a new land to them that they only rediscovered, in my opinion, they stepped forth upon Plymouth Rock. Now, as we've discussed through our tapes that we have presented, we find that Venus and many times other planets were described as rocks. We've quoted to you something very mysterious to the religious world, as they've not been able to comprehend what Daniel said and a lot of the things that he wrote about. And in our very first tape, Mr. Brown brought out the fact that Daniel was to seal up the book and the seal was to be broken in the latter days, when it talked about a rock, not made with earthly man's hands, but it would come down here and it would destroy the governments, which were represented by the feet of this beast, having 10 toes, and it said the feet were mixed of iron and clay. But this a great stone, as it says there, but rock, very much once and the same, as speaking of a planet, as I have maintained, that will pass over as it did in the Passover, and many other times coming in close proximity of this planet, causing great catalytic upheavals and destruction, both through natural phenomenon and divine intervention. And so, were they speaking, when they said Lake Titicaca, they named it in honor of those who came from the sea of space, who came from the great space station, the Rock. Was this the Plymouth Rock of the pilgrims from space? Now, as far out as you might think that sounds, a lot of people will go back and they will talk about the civilizations of Mexico and Peru, and they say, well, they only go back 1,000 years and some of them 1,500 years. But then they're left with a great enigma of some of these ancient cultures and civilizations. They don't know from whence they came and where they went, leaving behind great cities and architecture and remnants of science, as we will get into it in other chapters where they talk about a lot of the evidence that they found in Peru, that there seem to be records left of people who were in communication with things that seem to resemble radios and television sets. We're going to give the later on the historical and the archaeological written records of these things and the things that the Spaniards found. But a lot of people will go back and they will, if you were to go to Madrid in Spain and you were to go through their libraries and you were to study the accounts of Pizarro and the accounts of Cortez and the priests and some of those scribes who wrote them down, you have to keep in mind back in those ages that the mother church there, they discouraged the study of science, and they were not interested in anything but the Bible and gold in order to enrich the church and the nation, who worked hand in glove. And so, as we find, if you were to study these records, you would find that even the account of just one man, in just a few paragraphs, he would contradict his own conclusions. And so they were really not interested in these people and who they were and from whence they came. and they were only mildly curious when they spoke of the great Viracocha and equated them to Viracocha coming back. And they did not care very much about the fact that they spoke of Quetzalcoatl, which meant a man from Venus, and described him as the great feathered dragon, sometimes the great fiery dragon, talking about these men who came from Venus and came in these great ships of space. And so we find that you can put no stock or reliability in their ancient chronological records, because they were so worked up with a fervor of gold, and the priests were interested only in proselytizing these people to the Mother Church. So we have conflicting records, and I think that there is such a great field of knowledge yet to be discovered in ancient records there, but it has been ignored by the archaeologists and the scientists. But I believe those of you that will bear with us, that will be another subject in itself, that we will get together and we'll break these facts down, and we'll be able to tie all of these ancient people together as they came in contact with one another. Now, just in one passing thought, we always hear about Cain, who landed in Nod or Nod in Asia. Now, where did Adam and his descendants settle down to? Will we one day find that it was in the Americas? And I believe that there's a great possibility that it was in Peru. Perhaps Job, when he was talking about walls around the Adamic nations, possibly was he speaking of the Americas. Maybe time will bear this out, but I believe that I have to confess at times that there's doubt creeps into my mind that I believe that Job was giving mainly ancient accounts. And I think that others, as well as myself, we have tried to twist some of the things that he wrote about as into future prophecies. But the reason we need to pay attention to this, as many places in the Scriptures it tells us there is nothing new under the sun. Whatever has been shall be once again. And it tells us that whatever has happened in past times will only repeat itself. As we have tried to allude to the fact, possibly trying to prove that the ancient Phoenician sailors and explorers, they were from an earlier culture of Canaanites who brought the gold from Peru to King Solomon. Was it the Phoenicians who carved the trident of what we believe to be possibly of Poseidon on the cliffs of Peru, who worshipped him as the god of the sea, like the later Greeks did? But I believe that there is a connection there that ties Poseidon in with the god that they worshipped when Jonah went to Nineveh. That I believe that Dagon, and as the Asians say, Dogyu, I believe that they were all one and the same. Of this, referring to this great Poseidon of the sea. And I believe down through the ages man has lost the understanding that it was speaking of the great sea of space. As we've cited before, that in the book of Thomas, which has been rejected by the church world, there's a lot of young people going back and reading it now. And it starts out in that book, this is the words which Jesus spoke, and Thomas Didymus Judas wrote. I believe that's the way it went. Forgive me if I'm quoting it wrong, but Christ said, those that teach you that the kingdom of God is in the sea, he says, then the fish will precede you. Now, whether this was alluding to the ocean, or as it had been watered down to, literally, and they had forgot the ancient understanding of it, or was it referring to the sea of space? We don't know. This is lost in antiquity, but there's a great possibility to it. Now let us look for a moment at Revelations 12 of the King James, and it said, there appeared another great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, man has failed to understand the simplicity of this because it's so simple. Because our teachers have, in a large part, they have ignored, I say again, the idioms and the etymology of this language. Now, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. It's talking not about a literal woman, but it's an idiom speaking of a people. And it's telling us here where it is located. It's in between the sun and the moon. It would be what we would call our third planet. Now, you remember John, when he went to the holy city in outer space, he said he saw a new heaven. In other words, he saw a part of outer space he'd never seen before, and he said a new earth. In other words, a world. Not a planet like ours, but he saw a world. And he spoke of 3 doors on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the east, 3 on the west. And he also used an allegory there that has not been understood. He described it as a woman. Now, adorned as a bride. In other words, he equated in the ancient language, these people were like the bride of the Almighty. They were his wife. They were equated as his children and as his offspring. Now, if you can't buy that, then you better challenge your preacher the next time when he said he's coming for his bride. And then it goes on to say, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now we find that this was carried over. Christ picked 12 disciples. And he picked, later on, we know that there were 12 tribes. But our pastors have lost all of them. They're not lost, my friends. They're still here. Now you find that even in the footnotes of the King James, the one that I told you I use, that's called the World Bible, or well, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it says that the word wonder could be a sign or a symbol. So there you have it. There appeared a great wonder in heaven. A sign, a symbol of a people, a house, a family tree. Then number 2, they say heaven, as we have learned, means outer space. Well, this is my idea. Now, the point number 3, the woman that we have learned was Venus, called so by the Greek translators and their culture. But because we go back and we read so much about the depravity and the debauchery of many of the ancient Greeks, then we, let's say those of the religious world, they tend to ignore anything the Greeks say. But we hear all of the religious world saying, God is love. Yes, he loves his people. He loves his creation. He loves righteousness. But how can we ignore the clue there that the Greeks referred to Venus as the goddess of love? Now, goddess, that means, it can also mean in plural, people of love, people whom the Almighty loves. But then later on, man, his brains always slipped down below his belt buckle, and it became a phallic thing. It became a sexual symbol. Now, there's nothing wrong with sex and reproduction. It's a lovely thing. Until you get outside of the bonds of holy matrimony and the laws laid down by the Eternal for morality, well, we see where that's led us. Now we find that next the word clothed. In Greek, it implies its rotation about the sun. Now remember, Venus is always, not always, but a great predominance of the time, she's on the far side of the sun. My fifth point would be further proof of it being Venus, the moon beneath her feet, meaning that the moon being between Earth and Venus. Did the people of Venus step down on the moon as Christ described his stepping down on the earth? He said the earth was his footstool. As the Almighty's footstool, did Venus possibly have space stations at one time upon the moon? Why did the people step down on the moon? Were there nations there at one time? We hear of evidence of people, things that they left behind, but this is very hard to confirm. But I could quote all kinds of would-be evidence, but I do not have definite proof in my mind. But as we further get into the chapter, it tells of a great war in heaven or outer space. Does the stepping or standing on the moon imply an ancient idiom of war going on the moon? Was it at one time? Maybe not as far back as we think. Maybe possibly 6,000-7,000 years ago, before what the religious world calls the pre-diluvian age. Was it a live planet, populated not too many thousand years ago? Was there a great war in heaven that the Revelations 12 here is telling us of? Did it include the moon? Is that what really caused the craters? Does it look like there's a possibility of systematic bombing of it, leaving it a dead planet? I believe that future mankind will find that the craters, they were caused by a pattern of systematic bombing, which only time will tell. Was this planet, was it part or included in the great ancient wars of the old sages of India that they wrote about? Next, point 6. Next we have the word crown, which is worn by a king or a ruler. In this case, I believe that it proves the possibility that Sitson was correct, that there really was 12 planets in our solar system, which took Sitson approximately 436 pages to get across in his book entitled The 12th Planet. Now, I do not concur with a lot of things or a lot of sources that he quotes, but thank God for the man. He opened up my eyes to many things and many ancient records that I had never considered nor ever knew existed. So he opened up a whole new world of consideration to me. And I said, I think I will examine these things, see if there be any merit to it. But Revelation 12:1 proves this point. A lot of people will say that it represents the 12 tribes. But this took place centuries before the 12 tribes were here on earth. Now, if we think about what we're reading, this is an account by an extraterrestrial messenger about what went on in outer space or called heaven. Remember, it said there was a war in heaven. And this extraterrestrial messenger that took John on this flight, as we have proved in other chapters, that he, just like Elijah, went to heaven. If you want to use the old terminology and allegory, he was taken by the fiery chariots of heaven by an angel or extraterrestrial, and he was taken there and he was shown these things, and he was told to write down these accounts. Now verse 2, excuse me, from the Frau Fenton, and she, I put in parentheses here, Mother Planet Venus, was with child and cried and agonized and torment to bring forth. Now many people, as even I in my younger days, I believe, well, this was talking about the Virgin Mary, and she was wanting to bring forth the Christ child. But my friends, let's change our mindset and go back and open our eyes to the fact this was talking about something that took place in great antiquity. And let me digress for one moment and remind you one of the greatest joys in discovering this, where Job said, I came forth from the bosom of the Father and the womb of the morning. And we find that all of these heathen cultures, so-called, they They talk about the hollow bull. They talk about Venus as a bull and having horns. And those that over and over through all of these records talk about these star men or these god men who came forth out of it. And as we get into our studies, we're going to find that those that were on the inside, that they had some sort of satellite communication. They could see what was going on among the trees of the garden, meaning the other planets, that there was a war there. We're going to bring this out where Job, he talks about his children allegorically, the 7 sons, 3 daughters, and his wife and himself. That would make 12. So allegorically there he was alluding, I believe, as Sitson thought, that there was 12 planets. And then he talked about one of the messengers that came back to him and brought the account that fire had come out of heaven and had destroyed his sons in that particular area. Now, so if you were living in Venus and it was a great space station, hey, stop and think, wait a minute. Now, those that of us that are still dwelling with this old religious caveman mentality, how about our scientists today who are putting up this manned space station that they're going to call freedom? My friends, in them small cramped quarters and the bad luck that we have had putting these things into the air, killing all of those people, and I wouldn't call that freedom. And why is it? If we can see these things now, I can remember when I was a little child, if I heard an airplane going overhead, how excited I got. And I ran outside and I would gaze till my neck got sore until it went out of sight. And I used to think it was something like gods flying in the heaven. I sat and studied with kerosene lamps. We had no electricity, and we had outhouses. I didn't know that was bad. I thought the farm life was great. But in that day and age, if anybody had told me that we were going to land on the moon and that we were going to put space stations out there, I would have thought that they were a fugitive from a funny farm. I figured they belong in the Laughing Academy. But now, for us to boast about this and take this for granted or whatever, and then turn around and talk about the great Almighty that we've cited all through here, and he told about he had a house. He had a place of abode, quoting, that's what it said, a place of abode, and he said it was his forever, and he promised the man he was going to resurrect him in a body and that he would be with him in paradise. He wasn't lying to the man. And Paul, he spoke about a man that he met 14 years ago while on the backside of the desert, and we can't be sure whether Paul was talking about this was a messenger and he took him there, but he said that he had been to the third heaven. And here it's just explained in Revelation 12. And John said it had 12 floors, 12 foundations. I know this is mind-boggling, but now, more idioms. A lot of people of that planet appears, or that great space station, who I believe that they had satellite communications, had giant television sets where they could watch what was going on in these other worlds. And we talk now in our science, now this sounds so far out, but wait a minute. The Russian and Americans, we both have our spy satellites up there, several miles in space, and they have lenses on them where they can zoom down and actually read the license plate of a car on the highway. This is how we can watch the Russians, and they can watch us to see if we're developing any more sophisticated weapons. Now, don't you think that the Almighty, who has sons and daughters, don't you believe that those who had walked the chalk and stayed true to the Almighty, that they had science and technology like that, where they could watch everything on it? So now it makes sense that this space station is now referred to a woman, like the Greeks, a goddess of love, and they had the capability to watch that, and John talked about there was doors all the way around the perimeter of the thing, and they were anxious to go out. In other words, give birth. They wanted to go out of this womb of the morning. They wanted to leave it. They wanted to go and defend their brethren on these other planets. But maybe it was not the will of the Almighty at that time, because did He allow them? A lot of people are going to do and have and will get bent out of shape when the Almighty said, I created both the good and the evil. I created vessels of good and vessels of evil. He said, I am the potter and you're the clay. And He said, if I want to break the pot up and grind it down and make mud out of it and start over again, He said, I can do that. I'm the master, I'm the potter, and you're the clay. So maybe in their zealousness, as we see, especially in my day and age, after seeing all those John Wayne movies, they started to singing songs, over there, over there. Well, we were anxious to get a gun and go, and then I remember one day they put me on a ship, and I was realizing, my goodness, these people might be shooting back at me. But these people, in their zealousness to go to the defense of their brethren of neighboring family trees or planets, maybe it wasn't the Almighty's will at that time. Well, I'm getting off on too much speculation. But further in the chapter, we learn that all of this is an account of a great war in the heavens or outer space between planets and people, probably spilling over into other galaxies. Now, how do you fight extraterrestrial wars without extraterrestrial space stations and science that would dwarf our present knowledge? We have been exposed to enough knowledge to make Revelations 12 understandable to the 21st century man. I believe the idiom here is this way station. It's like a stagecoach station for intergalactic travelers. As we read in Genesis, it told of the Almighty walking among the trees. And if we can only get people to go back and research and study and understand and know that this is planets and people and races, and walking implies, when you go back to the original language, He flew there. He flew among these planets. He visited them. Just like we have our president and senators going to the different states and visiting them and going to foreign dignitaries in other lands. The Almighty can't be limited to one planet or galaxy, or He would not be the supreme being. And what else did the Christ say in the Father's house? There are many mansions. As I go to prepare a place for myself, I now go to prepare one for you also, that where I may be, you may be also. As He said He would be King of kings and Lord of lords, and He's going to rule throughout the universe. And you remember the promise that He made to Abraham. All of the great nations would come out of his loins, and you'd be like the sands of the seas and the stars of the heaven, without number, that no man could count, going on into infinity. So why is He creating a people? Why are we going through these trials and tribulations? We are being prepared for something that is beyond the scope of your imagination. Like Paul said, I run the good race, I fought the good fight, and I know for a fact that there's a crown laid up for me that no man shall ever take away. He will be given authority and a place to reign and rule from. And do we know for certain how many houses that Paul and some of our progenitors, these great men of the Almighty that were obedient, how do we know how many they will walk over or rule over? My friends, before we continue on, I would ask you now to please go to tape number 3. If you are confused, this is our third tape. We started out with atomic frisbees of antiquity, and it was on the back side of tape 2 that we started the Venusian Wars. Now we're continuing on this tape number 3 here of the Venusian Wars, and we'll go back and we're quoting from verse 2 here of Revelation's 12th chapter from the Friar Fenton, just to refresh you. And she was with child and cried, agonized and tormented to bring forth. We've explained those idioms, that in this great space station there was a mass multitude of people that were wanting to come forth and defend their brethren on the planets that in the old idiom were entitled the trees of the Garden of Eden, another ancient name for Venus. A lot of people of that planet, they were anxious to come outside of the planet. And were they talking about possibly intervening in this war and bringing it to an end? Or were they also speaking of a time that they were to go forth and to bring the remnants to colonize this earth and possibly other worlds, and or to defend the mother planet? As we're going to cover later on, we're going to give proof of this, that Venus was actually involved in this, what we proclaim by the evidence here, that it was an intergalactic war. And we'll prove it was actually struck by some very sophisticated missiles, and it was damaged. And I've wondered if there isn't somewhere, somehow, that this fits in, that it ties into with the ancient records that talk about the wars of the lords. Now, further in our chapters, we're going to learn that this is all an ancient account of a great war that took place in heaven or outer space between planets and people, possibly spilling over into other galaxies. How do you fight extraterrestrial wars without extraterrestrial ships and science that, as we said before, would dwarf our present knowledge? We've been exposed to enough knowledge to make Revelation 12 understandable to us, the 21st century man. We believe that the idioms here is this way station, as we said before, it's like a stagecoach station for intergalactic travelers. And we read in Genesis that told of the Almighty. Once again, we just want to remind you, bring you up to date, in case you've laid this tape aside or the last one. Say, let's see now, where did we leave off? As we pointed out that the Almighty, He came to visit Adam, and it said He was hiding among the trees. And it talks about the Almighty walking among the trees, the different peoples here. Walking implies, as we've shown from the ancient Hebrew and Chaldean, that He flew. The Almighty here, He cannot be limited to one planet or galaxy, or He would not be the supreme being that He claims to be, that He says that He can go out to Orion, and He speaks of all of these distant places in the galaxies. Now, verse 3 of Frau Fenn says, then there was another sign. Then another sign was seen in the heaven, or outer space. Then it goes on to say, a great red dragon. We're talking about the symbology here of a great extraterrestrial fleet, and where they were from, and how many were there. The verse goes on to say, possessing 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his heads 7 crowns. Now, we have all heard these people in church, they pontificate about this great cherubim, they call him, the great extraterrestrial angel who was put in charge over the Lord's house. And it appears there were several houses. And he goes on and he talks about this great adversary as to how great he was and how lofty and how mighty and how perfect he was in the day that the Almighty created him. Or was he brought from another further, more distant galaxy? I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt this is what is alluding to, but then it seemed he became very greedy and very vain and very egotistical. And so the 7 heads, I believe, was this talking about 7 planets, I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And then the 10 horns, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it seems that he had lesser horns or lesser rulers under him. Now the 12 and 2 here, reading from Fenton. I said, another, afterwards a great sign appeared in the heaven, a woman clad with the sun, and the moon beneath her feet, and upon her head was a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and cried, and agonized, and tormented to bring forth. So we see the woman, like the Greeks referred to Venus, the goddess of love. Now, she was clad with the sun. In other words, the sun was shining over the top of her, or on the other side of her, and the moon was beneath her feet. And she had a crown of 12 stars. So I believe that at one time, without going off on a sidetrack now, but the ancient Greeks and their idioms and their allegories and what we thought were mythical, fanciful stories where it talks about different women, their lovers, they couldn't bear to see them destroyed, and so they just left the area. Verse 3, Then another sign was seen in the heaven, a great red dragon possessing 7 heads and 10 horns, upon her head 7 crowns, and his tail swept down the third of the stars of the sky. Now, was this alluding to that there were 12? And a third, or almost approximately half here, were destroyed. And it goes on, it's talking about some of the people that were kicked out, like the ancient allegory, kicked out of the garden. It does not mean one place, but those kicked out of the planets. And it said, and a third of the stars of the sky, and threw them upon the earth. They weren't thrown down on the earth, they were transported to, they were dumped off, they were pilgrims. Then it goes on to say, and the dragon placed himself before the woman, who was about to be delivered, so that when she was delivered he might devour her child, or symbology, the children of the Most High. Some good guys here, the adversary, they were kicked out, and they didn't want these newcomers here bringing what? Like Christ said, have I not taught you how to pray, thy kingdom come, will be done on earth as it is in heaven, or outer space? So here were some people that wanted to recant, or they wanted to bring the laws, they wanted righteous rule. Now, a righteous man means a law keeper. They did not want any righteousness. As we say, it seems that there's evidence of the historical records we cannot deny, evidence proving that there was different types of men here on this earth that preceded the Adamic Semitic man. Again, we have to show that Strong's Concordance is not reliable because they give us the wrong interpretation of tail. We will leave it to the reader's common sense to judge. They refer us to O-U-R-A, which apparently a prime root word, a tail. They send you to 3769. The next word listed is Oranos, from word 3772. It's celestial, belonging to or coming from the sky, heavenly. And they send you off to also in 3772, they refer to Oranos from the same as 3735 through the idea, they say, quoting, elevation, the sky, by extension heaven, as the abode of God. By implication here, they get religious on us now, even though this was before Christianity and Christ appearing on the earth. We're quoting now, it goes on to say imply happiness, power, eternity. Then they go off and say especially the gospel, Christianity. My friends, it does not compute. Then they go on and say air, heaven, or sky of 3735. And then they refer to give us the next best clue, as we've shown in the chapters referring to mountains, which refer to governments and governments of the other world, or the house of Adam, as a great extraterrestrial aircraft carrier rising up or moving through space. That's my quote, not from them. Now, quoting Strong's Concordance, this 3735 word they refer to, OPOS, It's pronounced actually Oros or OS, probably from, they say, from OBSOLOPW, and they pronounce it Oro, meaning to rise or rear. Pertaining to or akin, they say, to 142, and the compilation of 3733, they say a mountain, as lifting itself from the plain, hill, mount, akin. Now we've proved where the confusion came in, referring to mounts, hills, and mountains, not understanding that they were great space stations, so forth. But in all fairness to Strong's Concordance, it was first released to the public in 1894, nearly 100 years before the advent of the airplane and the high technology of which we have today. They gave us, the future generation, the clues and the proofs for us to search out in our time. Now, the reason we give this somewhat repetitious information, we should say, is to prove that there were mighty spaceships and planets that took part in this great extraterrestrial space battle, that involved planets that took part in the war in heavens or outer space, or heavens, as the religious call it. Now, the word 3733 shows that it was something that flew. They go from mountains to birds, as they dared not voice it aloud in their time. Though they were aware of Christ telling of eagles in Luke 13, in 1737, and Moses being reminded that he had been picked up by an eagle ship and brought safely to the Almighty. And they didn't seem to question that, and whereas we've said before, the confusion came in because nobody realized what the burning bush was, and Genesis, as we've said before, is not in chronological order, so they were not able to connect the two. Now, 3733, Ornis, O-R-N-I-S, probably from the form of the 2 of the base of 3735. I'm quoting Strong's. They say, as a bird, as rising in the air. Then the 142, they send you off to, they put in the fact of air travel, but they could not comprehend it, adding their opinions, destroying the aircraft idea, which they could not conceive in their time, rightfully so. Note that they start out with the word aero, A-I-R-O, like an aeroplane or airplane, according to the dictionary, but they lose its meaning by trying to explain it away in their time of no air travel. Aeroplane, or airplane, as it's spelled different in the British. Airplane is the American rendition of the word. Now, Strong's Concordance 142. I believe today that this is where we got the word airplane from, or aeroplane. A-I-R-O, and it's pronounced aero, a prime verb meaning to lift, by implication to take up or away. Sounds like Superman, up, up, and away. Now, figuratively, they say to raise, keep in suspense. But here they think, well, maybe they're talking about the voice of the mind, and so we can see where men get off on a lot of these esoteric ideas that do not compute. Then they go on to say, especially to sail away, as to weigh anchor. By the Hebrew, they say, compare 5375, it means to expedite, away with, bear up, carry, lift up, loose, put away, remove, take, away up. And so there they have the honest explanation, and they put it in even though they couldn't comprehend it. So they thought that this was the Almighty God raising His voice or something to them. Here we have the old translators turning it into a metal ship, not realizing flight of a space vehicle. We pointed out before how it also means to breathe effortlessly, as in a pressurized cabin of an airplane or some type of airship. Verse 4, it goes on, the tail could only apply possibly a small remnant of the original attacking extraterrestrial forces that survived that great aerial battle. Proof that his tail swept down the third of the stars, meaning that was all that was left after the battle. Were they getting ready for the next battle? It says he threw or landed them on the earth, or our planet, and we have assumed that it was this planet. Can we be sure that the moon beneath her feet was not involved? He said he places himself before the woman. The moon is before the planet Venus, is closer to our earth. Remember John of Revelations, he went to a new earth, a planet new to him in his lifetime. As we proved Venus was, and he described as a bride adorned for her husband as the king. Now as we read very carefully how he placed himself before the woman who was about to be delivered, meaning a fleet of sons that were about to leave the great gates that John described, or the womb of the morning. More proof on the idioms of the Bible of delivered, dispatched, give birth as coming out of the womb of the morning star Venus, the great space station. Remember Job in Farrar Fenton's edition in chapters 1 and 2. He told of an accuser that was going to and fro over the earth, flying from earth to Venus. How did the great or why, as we've said before, why did the great Lord of space, the Almighty, the Yahweh, the ever-living, or the one that Christ had called the Father, why did he have to ask the accuser where he had been if this earth was the only one that he was in charge of? So if we could only know and understand the great antiquity of the book of Job, as I believe that we have shown in other chapters, I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, Moses himself brought back this great book of antiquity, which many honest scholars do say is the oldest book in the Bible, but we have no idea of the great accounts in there and the great records and the things that he told about that are simply confirming this 12th chapter of Revelation. Now, the woman that he placed before him was the one that was later to be called Israel, or the Virgin, as the Virgin is what they think they was speaking of as the Virgin Mary, as the religious and including myself in time past and supposed for years was referring to the Venus or the Virgin as the woman. Once again, we remind the reader of John's account of landing in this other world. As he got closer, he said that the seas of his own world disappeared. As they got ready to land in this planet, it appeared to come down to him. Now, let me remind you once again, like Revelations from the King James Version 21, and we'll start verses 1 to 3. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first earth, in other words, the one he left, was passed away, and there was no more sea. In other words, he was given an account at a period there, he got up so high he couldn't even distinguish the oceans from the land, and today we call the earth the blue planet. And then verse 2, and I, John, I saw the holy city. Now he calls it New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Coming down. Well, if you were landing on it, you remember, give the old boy a little slack. He'd never been on anything higher than a jackass. And here he is flying in a spaceship, so they're starting to land, and it looms closer to him. It gets bigger and bigger. It appears to be coming down to him. Then he goes on to say in the third verse, I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold. Now he tells you what this New Jerusalem is, this holy city. He said, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. In other words, has men in it. And he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. Note he calls it an earth also. The first earth is the one which John flew from. Once inside, he called it a holy city, a New Jerusalem, a bride made up of people like himself, adorned for their husband. And they were what adorned this tabernacle, as it's called, this tabernacle of the Almighty. Now the church world tells of Christ coming for his bride or believers, but they fail to understand that he has other brides in and on other planets or possibly space stations, if we could only conceive of this in our century. And what's holding us back? It's the Dark Age dogma of religiosity, because they did not have the ability or the comparison to be able to understand this until this century. Verse 1, it speaks of the Almighty speaking to Job and an or John, in an extraterrestrial ship. I take that back. I'm getting tongue-tied here. Verse 1 tells of the Almighty speaking to Job in the book of Job. It describes this extraterrestrial ship, which is called a whirlwind by the translators, which is merely describing its actions of something that's turning and spinning and creating a disturbance in the air or our atmosphere. In verse 7, the stars of the morning sang together, it said. And we know the morning star or morning star is using archaic English word is Venus, as we have seen. The next verse tell of the sons of God, plural. They're shouting for joy. King James makes it more understandable that the sons of God were in the morning star. The stars that sang meant the young princes of the morn. Christ said that he was the King of kings and Lord of lords. Now, King James, verse 7, says that when the morning star, or the sons of the citizens of Venus, the morning star, we know that there's only one morning star. And then it said that they, the sons, shouted for joy. Verse 13 of Job 38 and Friar Fenton tells us of the bad ones driven out or flown out. Verse 8, we have proof of a racial stream coming out of the garden, when it speaks of when the sea was shut up within the doors, the sea of people inside. Remember, Revelation tells of 12 doors. Here's the rest of verse 8. When it came with a rush from the womb, which is symbolic of countless people coming out of that planet or the great space station. Compare it once again with Revelations 2, and all of this took place in outer space, my friends, not on this earth. Now, and she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. In other words, delivered somewhere. And verse 2, the idiom here equates it to the woman or Venus giving birth to the sons of God coming out of the inside of this great space station. The word delivered, translated from the Greek, T-I-K-T-O, it has several meanings. Tiktu, it means to bring forth, be delivered to this earth, and so forth. Now, as we go back to Job 38 and 8, it says when they came out with a rush from the womb, this morning star, Venus, space station. Verse 9 describes the cloud layers hiding this planet or space station. The King James Version refers to the cloud layers instead of fog. Now, our scientists now have infrared cameras. They've already, since I first gave this lecture, we know that they've gone over with their cameras and that they had hoped to take pictures through the cloud layers. And they found some very remarkable things. I think they found a lot of things that they're not telling we the masses about. But anyway, verse 12, it describes Venus as always having been governed by the dawn. It could be only Venus, the morning star, the dawn star. Verse 14 describes it covered with a robe. Now we've pointed out how the Apocrypha, the 14 books of the Apocryphal writings, they said the same thing about the robes of clouds and the cloud coverings. And we've pointed out how ancient kings and rulers of renown, they wore bracelets that looked like watches where they had 12 rosette type symbols on them. And we thought these, I do believe that these represented the 12 planets of the old solar system. Now here's a clue that Friar Fenton said has confused translators for centuries. Verse 14, with her vesture of rosette blooms. This is no longer a mystery. I believe that it's a description around the belt of the middle of this space station, which we have assumed was a planet. This belt is made up of 12 giant hangar doors that John described on his tour to the space station. 3 doors all the way around on north, south, east, and west. This raises a question as to whether there is more traffic coming and going from all directions of the universe. Now, one thing, I may be off base here, but it's something to consider. I don't know how many of you saw the pictures that they had brought back, and they talk about all of these fissures and cracks all over this planet, and then they showed 3 giant big circles on there that they thought that some great asteroid or something had hit it, but they were surprised it was only sunken in 12 feet. They have no idea of the great mighty construction of this thing that is able to repel forces beyond the scope of our imagination. As we're going to find out later on, it has double walls in it. I think it's probably like a bumper on some of our new cars. It's like a shock absorber that is be able to take the shock on the outside, never penetrating the in. And also, why is it that they figure that these great round circular indentations on there only go in 12 feet? Is this possibly where the sulfur and the dust and the derbish from outer space has collected on there and it's sunk in where these doors are that are to be open? I don't know. That's a lot of speculation on my part, but it is worthy of thought. Now, verse 14 from King James, it is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand like a garment, like a belt of round doors. Is there a clue here, turned and sealed? Is this referring to great round portal doors like a submarine which is sealed to their extraterrestrial air forces ready? Another possibility on verse 14, using the King James, it is turned. Strong's Concordance shows that there's a change in the word. The Hebrew they give the Hebrew word is hap, a prime root. It means to turn about or over as opposite direction, as to be converted, as changing direction, as making a bed, overthrow, turn, perverse, tumble. Now remember, the scientists tell us that this great space station is turning in retrograde. Turn again, aside, back to, contrary, every way. In other words, I think the clues they were given here, and the translators, and they couldn't understand it till this day, they were describing the planet that was turning in retrograde. I think that the fly walked, as we said before, I think that a fly walked in the ink. Here they mistranslated the word H-E-P, H-E-K, hippic, from H-A-P-H-A-K. Now, H-A-P, haphack, it means a turn, reverse, contrary. It sounds like the great red dragon fleet that was composed of 7 kings or 7 rulers and 10 horns representing lesser rulers, and crowns possibly was planets. So with not trying to confuse you, the listener, I hope that at a very, very soon that I will be able to share with you a lot of new evidence that I have uncovered, as I've had a great curiosity about the Americas, as they are called, and the outrageous sounding claim that I have made about Peru and down to the Yucatan and through Mexico, that it is my belief that these space invaders, these pilgrims, not only the Semitic people that we know as the Adamic peoples that settled there, because there is evidence of every type of race in the world. They left behind these sculptures that I said. And I believe that we'll find here where it talks about the 10 horns and the rulers and lessers, you find in studying what is available that, we'll cite many men that back in the 30s and so forth, that they took expeditions down there. And they spoke of the Mayans and about their language and how they divided down into some of the very same numbers of kings and rulers here, like of the 10 horns and so forth, referring to the Mayans. And there seems to be, according to them, that a lot of archaeological evidence that they were the children of Mu. Well, later on we like to get into this and show, and I believe the man has some facts there, that the Mayans were the descendants of the people called Mu, but they went to a great deal of trouble trying to prove that Mu and Eden were one and the same. And then, like a lot of these people who perpetrate about the lost cities of Atlantis and so forth, that they went beneath the sea, never dreaming in their wildest dream that it was talking about islands in space called planets. They did not realize that Mu was actually one of the trees that was in the Garden of Eden, belonging to the headquarters of Eden, one of their territorial planets. Like Alaska is not connected to the United States, but yet it is one of our territories under our government and our rule at present time. But just like it, we bought it from the Russians, so we find that these ancient planets, they, through the eons and the ages of antiquity, that they changed rulerships and authorities, and a lot of them becoming conquered lands. And then we find about ancient people of antiquity that they were called the Quetzals, like in Quetzalcoatl. So, and there seems to be a lot of evidence, which even I myself ran across while exploring into the, what they call in South America, the Amazones, the Amazon jungle. And I spent a lot of time down between Peru and in Colombia, 1,000 miles into the jungle. And I remember talking to doctors and priests down there that had run these prison camps, which I filmed back in the 60s. And they told about a civilization of men and women who were averaged over 6 foot tall. They were blue-eyed and blonde, and they had a language that they were not able to connect to any other language. I knew this medical doctor that had devoted many years to working down there with prisoners and natives and so forth, and he said that he could speak some French, some German, some English, and naturally he was fluent in Spanish and a couple other languages, but he said that he could not connect this language to any other, and they would not teach you the language under penalty of death if they did. So I wondered in my mind if they were descendants of the ancient Quetzals, like in Quetzalcoatl, the man from Venus. But there's a lot of exciting things here that we'll cover in other times. But now let us go back to the adversary and his tail that swept down, it says, the third of the stars of the sky and threw them up on the earth. What is meant by the third of the stars? It's talking about people and children of planets. Common sense tells us most stars are many times the size of our earth. Even one colliding with earth would destroy our planet. So if we let Scripture interpret Scripture, we find the answer in Job 38:1 to 13 in the Farrar Fenton Bible. I believe that we can find many answers there, long rejected and misunderstood until the compiling of this tape, or these tapes, I mean to say, this tape program. And a lot of people have asked me, why haven't you put it into a book? Well, it's very simple, my friends. I've hired people to edit the book, and a lot of them professing to be journalists and educational. They're not able to follow me. They're not able to put it in a concise order, and they get all bent out of shape if I use the word etc. and so forth. That is not vogue in the writing of today, yet I have many books in my library, such as one that I've mentioned. It's a favorite of Bullinger. He uses, about every page, he uses the word etc. And it is my contention that the average man of the street, he's not interested, or does he care whether it's linguistically correct. But the whole point of this is to gain knowledge. So if I take the time for all of this editing and putting everything in correct chronological order, worrying about whether I've repeated myself, where I have been repetitious, it is for a purpose. For those who might be struggling through, trying to listen to this and to make sense of it, as the subject is new to most people, I have to be somewhat repetitious so that you would be able to follow me. And I do ask those that are familiar with it, I ask your forgiveness. But let us continue on now in this 38th chapter of Job. Fenton puts the title over it, The Address of Jehovah. Now, as to whether this is implying the Almighty, ever-living Father of heaven, or whether it's just talking about some of his space lords. But I think that it was probably the Most High. But, well, it doesn't matter either way. Let's try to see what we can learn from it. Then Jehovah answered to Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that obscures reflection? Somebody trying to hide the facts, hide the understanding, by speech on what he knows not. Like a hero, now gird up your loins, and I will ask you, and you answer me. Where were you when I founded the earth? Which earth? This one? Inform, if you know, of my plan. Who fixed its extent? Since you know, or who on it stretched out the line? On what and where its timberlings laid? Or who vexed its keystone on high? Now, a lot of that gives me mental indigestion. I'd have to do a lot of research where I could give you a good explanation. You may want to get your concordance out and search it out. I'm sure there's a lot of wonderful things hid there. I say that the whole Bible needs retranslating, looking at it in the 21st century light, and what a fabulous book we would have. But no, it seems people want to go take what they call the Living Bible. Well, that's a lie right there. The Living Bible, as they call it, is not a Bible. If the publishers were honest and the man that put it together was honest, he would say, this is not a translation. This is one man's opinion, as he put it into modern English. But yet you can see his mind, like my mind was, and many of us, is contaminated by religious views, and ignoring the scientific and the historical. Well, getting back to this. Or who fixed his keystone on high, starting verse 7 now, when the stars of the morn sang together, and the sons of God, plural, shouted for joy, when the sea was shut up within doors. And it's talking about a great sea of people. Like another scripture in the Bible said, I heard the sea and the waves roaring. It was talking about people in the ancient etymology. But listen, verse 8, when the sea was shut up within doors. This is talking about the space station Venus. This is talking about the New Jerusalem, the holy abode of God. It's talking about his altar, the horned altar. It's talking about the great bull of space. It's talking about the great rock. It's talking about that heavenly Jerusalem, the house of the Almighty, that the John of Revelation visited, that he said it had 12 doors on it. The rest of verse 8. When it came with a rush from the womb. Now he's talking about people leaving in great ships. They came with a great rush at great speeds. They came out of the inside of it. Verse 9, when I gave it the fogs instead of clouds, he says, I gave it the fogs for a cloak, and in darkness and wrapped it around, and over it laid my decree. I fixed it with bars and with doors. Well, my friends, without getting too toothy on that, bars and with doors, when Ezekiel later on, he talks about when Russia goes to invade the United States, not only Russia and China and the Mongolian people and the great hordes, they go up to the new and unwalled Jerusalem. Now, I was talking about a second Jerusalem here on this planet, and it says has neither bars nor gates. In the old idioms of that language, he says that they're left without a defense. As I pray to God in heaven that I am wrong, but Bush and those of our Congress who have sent all of our young men and equipment 10,000 miles around the earth there, well, that's a little exaggerated, but my friends, they are surrounded by these people that are going to call the holy jihad, and Russia just going to stand back and watch us get our tail whipped like the old tail of the dragon. And so what will we have there when this comes to pass? Will it be a fourth of our armies and equipment, or a third, or will it end up to be half? And we will have another repeat of Vietnam. I pray to God that I'm wrong. I don't want to depress you. But my friends, when we as a nation have total disregard for the Almighty's laws, there's going to be hell to pay. And just like King David when he disobeyed Samuel the prophet and held the census, there was 70,000 men were killed in battle because of his disobedience. That's the law. I don't care if people like that or not, but that is the truth. But going down, let's go back to verse 10. And over it laid my decrees. Then I fixed it with bars and doors. And he said, so far can you come, nor advance, but there stayed you proud waves. Once again, see, waves, Veracocha. When they greeted the Spaniards, Veracocha, which means foams of the waves, but we don't understand the etymology of these ancient languages, but now it's becoming more clear. Verse 12 starts out, all your days have you governed the dawn. That's the morning star. Taught the morning to know her own place. The morning star, that she's in a certain place in orbit. She knows where she belongs. Now, again, as we told you before, like in the Babylonian sculptings and the ancient Egyptians, we see these proud warriors or kings that wear these bracelets, as we discussed a short time ago, like rosette blooms. And here he goes on to say in 14:1, as he calls it, it's actually the 14th verse, with her vestures of rosette bloom, talking about the 12 doors around it that John visited, and draped it with a robe. Now, a robe, I think as we read from the King James Version, it speaks of an overcoat of clay. All right, here we go. Job, the 38th chapter and the 14th verse. It is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. 15th verse of King James. And for the wicked their light is withholding, and the high arm shall be broken. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in search of the depths? Verse 17, have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Well, so much for that. Let us go back to Fenton now. With their vestures of rosette bloom, and draped it as with a robe. The King James says as a robe of clay. Now to seize upon the wings of the earth, to drive off the bad from her face. So it tells you where they're coming from, and as they rush out the gate, as they go out the doors, and this is from where judgment comes. Now, he goes on, Friar Fenton puts in his footnotes, on verse 14, he put a little 1 beside it there, should be by the sense read after verse 12, which has been displaced by some old translators. There are various readings of the 14th of the book of Job. They tell of the sons of God in the womb, or inside of this great space station, Venus, from which judgment comes. They refer to them as the sons of the morn, or morning star, and it says the morning stars sang together. Venus is the morn, or morning star, according to the Geneva Bible of 1600 A.D., which, by the way, if you think you need one, they are rather expensive. There was only 1,000 of them reprinted. And if you need one, send for one. That's another $5 for shipping, and we'll get it off to you. There's hundreds and hundreds of fabulous footnotes put in there by the men of the Reformation, John Calvin, John Knox, and etc. And anyway, I don't like to do a commercial, but if you're a bibliophile like I am, then you would definitely want one. So, also, Venus is many times called an evening star also. We know from our latest scientific data that Venus, it rotates, as we've said before, in retrograde, or it spins in the opposite direction or counterclockwise, while Earth and other planets spin clockwise as they traverse around their sun. Then it says that it turns in clay. In other words, it appears on the outside as just another planet of dirt, rock, or clay. Then it goes on to say, to the seal. They stand for a garment. In other words, these outside garments is like an overcoat covering the body of a man whose skin is the real shell, or the real shell of the man that is inside this overcoat. What is the real inner garment made of? And of that, what is it that makes it last so long, or has lasted for thousands of years? Kind of boggles our little earthly carnal minds. But the clay is referred to as a garment covering an inner shell. And again, the word garment is used referring to several layers of clouds covering the planet. Job 38:9, the implication of the swaddling bands, if you go read in your King James, when I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band. Now, even when I was a kid, I remember my mother putting a band around the waist of my baby brother to keep his, or to help hold his navel in. So this is, so that it would not protrude later. So this is an idiom showing that there was 12 doors around the middle of the space station. So it seems that Venus, or this morning star, is referred to by the ancients as a womb for the children of the ever-living. And the doors that enclose them are the swaddling band. In fact, Fenton and all there, he refers to them as doors. Now, if this sounds funny to you, the reader, by referring to the analogy of doors to the womb of Venus, I say that this is another ancient idiom and parable. Now, Job 3:10 from the King James, because it shut not the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from my eyes. I think that's wonderful. Let me read that again. Because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from my eyes. My, how many millions of people throughout all of the ages have read that, and how few comprehended it. Aren't you lucky to live in this time and hour, this generation? Now, Psalms 110, a Psalm of David. The first 4 verses, and the Lord said unto my Lord, set thou at my right hand, until I make thine enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Out of Zion. The seat of government in heaven is talking about Venus. Then he goes on to say, rule thou in the midst of thy enemies. Verse 3, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, and the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. In other words, this Christ that died and resurrected, he's like the dew of his youth. He's back. He's a young man again. Verse 4, the Lord, we're speaking of the ever-living there, has sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He's given us a clue here, as we cited in the other tape. And it talked about this place, this house of the Almighty that received gifts from earthly men. And we quoted to you about Melchizedek, who was without mother, who was without father, who was without beginning of days or end of days. Now, speaking in outer space of his enemies as the footstool, earth beneath Venus, verse 2, he proves in the past chapter, or we have, I mean to say, that there is a heavenly Zion, a morning star. Zion is the seat of extraterrestrial government. Verse 3, David knows of his people and his brethren coming out of the womb of the morning, as he refers to it as the womb or inside of the morning star. Now, all religions tell people that they're going to go to heaven, but no one's ever told them where. In the last few dark ages, which we're still in, we say that we're still in them until earthman can pay attention and to the facts and to the scriptures that tells us where the seat of government is, and there will be other planets and the seat of government will rule over them. But the reason people don't like me to point out the seat of government, because if they recognize that, then they'll have to recognize the laws that come there from there. Now, why have a government of the people of the United States if there are no states? In this case, the government is of this intergalactic worlds that are without end. We felt that it was important to take so much time to explain Revelations in 12. And we left off in the middle of 12:4, and we shall pick it up there again. Man has failed to read Revelations 12 in its proper context. It is one of those chapters that reads like a telegram. It starts out in outer space, then stops. Then it covers an event here on this earth where a son of outer space comes to earth, dies, overcomes death, and then he's escorted back to a specific place in outer space, then stop. And the telegram goes back to the war in heaven. Now, Revelation 5 is speaking of the Queen of Heaven and the bride planet Venus. Verse 5, and she bore a son, a man who will rule with a rod of iron all of the nations, and her child was conveyed up towards God and towards his throne. They have failed to tell us where this throne is, and I'm telling you. Here it is speaking of his original home, out of whom he came, who was returned to the throne. The interesting thing is that the great archangel Gabriel is called a warrior by strong concordance. He's only mentioned in the books of Dan and Luke. It makes us think that there is a lot left out of our scripture that could clear up many things. And it was like Luke, who wrote of Gabriel going to the Virgin Mary. And was he not from the morning star, the seat of the government? Luke 1, 19 to 26 tells of this extraterrestrial messenger Gabriel going to Zacharias, who was then an old man, and his wife, she was stricken in years, as it says, and it tells that they were to have a son who was later to become John the Baptist. Now, I believe in angels, but I don't believe that they perform magic. There's something that is included, science and genetics here. And we have an account of this extraterrestrial going to Mary, as just quoting Luke 1 and 35, and it goes on to say, and the angel answered and said unto her, the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also the holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. He was to be called that. But my friends, without arguing with anybody, he was God incarnate. It said he would just be called that. Next we have verse 6 of Revelation 12 that has been misinterpreted and misunderstood, thinking it pertained just to the Virgin Mary, or the woman Israel, as she's called. Now, to keep in context with the angel and reminiscing on the ancient event that happened at least 5,600 years before the meeting with John, verse 6, but the woman fled in the desert, where God had a retreat prepared for her, so that that they might be fed, or they might feed her for 1,260 days. Here, Friar Fenton, he didn't translate it right because he didn't have the knowledge that we're exposed to here in the 21st century. Now, the next few comments will probably blow away the average listener. And how big can we think? How big can we reason? My friends, if you keep talking about this Heavenly Father, that He's a great God and Almighty, don't put limits on Him. When I try to glorify and magnify and tell how great He is and enumerate His great powers and His science and knowledge, then people call me a kook. Well, my friends, I tell them, you got a little bitty God. You got a genie in a Coke bottle, and you only let him out every Sunday for 45 minutes, and then you want him to get back there so you can go home and eat Martha's fried chicken. But I can understand why the average person would not be getting this or understanding the great possibility. I spoke at a meeting here in the Ozarks in a little rural church, and while I was speaking on ancient Babylon, and all the audience had a 1,000-yard stare. Afterwards, the preacher, who was in a very apologetic voice, he said, if it didn't or does not happen here in this county, they don't know or they don't care about it. So their thinking was very limited, as mine used to be. It is speaking of the planet where the people were about to be delivered to this planet, and where else? But you see, when it talks about the desert and so forth, it is talking about the bush, the outback, like the great sea of space. And people, they argue with me about this because they don't have the capacity or the time to go and study the etymology of the ancient language. And so if they don't understand, they have to blame me. Now that I've had my little pity party, let's get back on the subject. Now, we're speaking of this planet with the people that are about to be delivered to this planet, and where else? The war that must have been so fierce that I believe that this is one of the times that the ancient records of all of the nations, including the accounts of the Bible, and what it was referring to was that Venus literally, and maybe, and I pray that it's true and that I should live to see it, there'll be somebody come along behind me and prove, as it gives the days in there, the periods of how long that was hid out in the desert of space. This is one of the times that the ancient astronomers talked about the planet Venus being moved clear out of space. The whole planet was moved into deep space, I believe, in order to protect this space station and its inhabitants. Remember the ancients of the Americas, when they spoke of Venus, it had a beard and horns of fire, depending on which direction it was to move. Now, we've quoted other accounts of ancient writings that have had great knowledge of the heavenly orbs. There was times when Venus was missing in their ancient astronomical accounts. Yet other times that they said that it come in such close proximity of this planet that it was brighter than the sun. Now, we've all read books and other reports on everything from the moon, from Stonehenge to the pyramids, but we cannot confirm any of these things. But where the base stations on the moon or ancient civilizations, were they there before there was a great war? We've heard all of these reports, as I say, They believe that there's a Stonehenge on the moon, but I can't document this. And they talk about pyramids. And I remember many years ago, take this for what it's worth, I don't have any documentation other than my own word. But we talked to people up in Canada about when the men landed on it. They spoke about that there was spaceships that were set in a line there and watched the men as they landed on it. But we heard no such report here in the States. It had been cut off. They edited that out. And then when we see the photos of Mars that show a great pyramid and several pyramids with very distinguishable face of a man on it, it appears that there are smaller pyramids beside this very large one, which is very distinct. And they're many, many miles apart. There must have been a very advanced civilization there before the great catastrophic war that where these people had to abandon this planet. The survivors came here in great numbers. Now, there, let's see, I lost my train of thought there. But, as I was saying, there was had to be some sort of a very advanced civilization. But as we've said in other chapters, like that face that is on Mars, and in future tapes here, I have some scientific background on this, and we have some historical background, and we have the Chaldean records on it. I think it'll knock your socks off. But it must have been a very vain, egotistical, self-centered personage who built this mile-long face on the planet there. And why did he build it with the face going up? It wouldn't be very distinguishable as to what it was on the Earth. So apparently there had to be a lot of people flying there from other planets and landing on it to see his pretty face there on it. Now, we have learned how Daniel from time to time has said he stood up, meaning to engage his mighty air force. Revelation 12, it tells of the intercession in the ancient past and again the times of Christ. And it seems to point to our day when this mighty archangel and his extraterrestrial air force will do it again. Read for yourself from Daniel 12, 1-4. This knowledge was to be sealed, it said, until the last days, and they said they would run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And we know that we can fly to Europe and other nations in a very short amount of time. But I noticed in the footnotes years ago of the Companion Bible, which is a King James Version, but they translated it, they shall run to and fro, and madness shall increase. Now, we could fill a whole tape deck full of madness that's going on, but we will leave it as such. Let's go to this 12th chapter here of the book of Daniel. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince. See, he's one of the lords of space. He's one of the Jehovahs, one of the Yahoos, as it's translated. And it talks about, as we spoke of the book of the War of the Lords. But going on, he speaks of let me start over. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation even to the same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that is found written in the book. Now Revelations talks about the book of life. And you remember the prophet of old, get your concordance out. And he says, oh, but my name was written in the rock with an iron pen. Now the rock is Venus. It's the womb of the morning. It's the birthplace of mankind on this earth. And this prophet of old is saying, oh, but to God my name, my genetical code, my genetical fingerprints are written there in the computers of that rock of the house of the ever-living. Far-fetched as you sound, don't you limit the Almighty. Don't you say he can't do that unless your God is a big spook and performs black magic and all mystical kind of hucky-pucky. Now, if you want to dwell in that type of a realm, that's fine. I'm not looking for any followers that I can spend all of my life trying to please, because I can't please everybody, and I don't care about pleasing anybody. All I care about is getting the truth across. I don't say that I have all of it, but I don't see too many people that want to go line upon line or precept upon precept with me. They're not conversing in this. And so instead of admitting it, a lot of them, it's easier to call someone else a fool. But so much for that. Now, verse 2, it goes on to say here in Daniel, many that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. But, my friends, if you look it up in the original language, it talks about all that are asleep in the dust. Otherwise, why are some of these going to be raised to shame and everlasting contempt? But it goes on the third verse, and they that be wise, they shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. My friend, that's talking about something in outer space. And they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Righteousness, my friends, that's the law. Going back to law, that's what a righteous man is, that obeys God and His laws and His commandments and His statutes and His judgments. No, you don't have to sacrifice lambs anymore. There was a lamb that died on Calvary. That part is the only part that was done away with. But I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of some of these pasteurized prophets that stand there on Judgment Day. I don't believe there'll be one of them get up in his face and say, brother, we're not under the law. We're under grace. We can run them up. Now the listener, well, let's see, let's go back here, wait a minute. Now verse 4. But here, my friends, think of this, and enjoy and rejoice in this. But thou, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. But those who are living in this age and hour, then we can understand it. Now the listener, he may question the part about the woman that fled into the desert. Flew into where? Deep space. King James said that she fled into the wilderness, and they both thought it was a geographical area on this earth. Now as we go on to Strong's Concordance, looking up the word wilderness, we find that if it were translated today by an honest man that knew the language, who had scientific knowledge to translate it, he would have had these choices to choose from. And in all fairness, now centuries ago, they didn't know about aviation possibilities. They didn't have the scientific background. And there were several word possibilities to choose from, desert and wilderness. My friends, I believe I can prove to you here they were really not good choices. Boy, sometimes I hate this Strong's. A small print here, it drives me up the wall. Here's what Strong's Concordance said it could have been as referring to wilderness. The word was E-R-E-M-O-N, I believe. It was Ir-Yai-Mos. They said of uncertain affiliation. Means lonesome, by implication to waste, usually as a noun. 5561 being implied desert, desolate, solitary, wilderness. Something out there's alone. Note, desolate, solitary, as in deep space. Now the 5561 they refer this to here is Korah, feminine of a derivative of the base of 5490 through the idea of empty expanse, room, space, or territory, like of that space, more or less extensive, often including its inhabitants. Or it could be a coast, country, fields, ground, land, or region. Then they send you to 51:17. But note, empty expanse, a space of territory. All right, now, 54:90 was kashma, from a form of an obsolete prime root here. It means ko. It means to gape or yawn, a chasm or vacancy, impassable interval, a gulf, a great gulf in outer space. You remember when we talked about Gilgamesh, and he went into this great space there, this great gulf that he had to cross, and his friend told him, you're not going to be able to, the extraterrestrials won't allow you. Now we go to 51:17, and the word is topos. Apparently a prime root, a spot generally in space, they say. Here's a book 90-some years ago, but they're honest. It proves our point. Listen, a place in space, but limited by occupancy. Maybe they were fussy about who moved into their neighborhood. And it goes on to say, whereas 55:61 is a larger, but by particular locality, a location, has a position, a home, tract, etc. Figurative condition, opportunity, especially a scabbard. Now, in the Fenton, old King David, he said, oh, to God that he would let me draw my sword from this sheath of flesh. Means coast, license, plain, plain quarter, rock, room, and where. Here it describes a place in space, also a particular place in space, a home in space, a scabbard symbolic of something that you keep a sword in this case warships. Daniel told of the rock cut out without man's hands, referring to his house, then the word where, implying that we should find its location. This is what I'm trying to do. The word clay in Hebrew in verse 14, referring to the outer shell, also called a rock by the prophet Daniel. The word translated clay is C-H-O-M-E-R. Comer, clay, cement, motion, and mortar. Does this sound crazy? Let's let Scripture prove by the promise. Now, however, it goes on to say, the 14th verse, and the woman was, however, supplied with 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the desert to her retreat, where she was fed for a time and times and half a time, away from the presence of the serpent. She left these other planets, these 7 planets that Christ said that he holds in his right hand. Now Moses, he was reminded by the Almighty how he was brought safely on eagle's wings unto him. But here it refers to a great eagle. Now some may think that we've jumped ahead to verse 14, taking it out of context, but each paragraph can have hundreds, if not thousands of years in between the paragraphs as the angel swept the great panorama of history, past and present and future. Now the 7th verse, there was a great war in heaven, and Michael and the angels waged war with the dragon, and the dragons and his angels fought, but they could not conquer, nor was a place any longer found for them in heaven or in space. We're reading from the Fenton. And then it says, and the great dragon was thrown out, the old serpent, called the devil, the accuser, the deceiver of the whole habitable world. Now, if you think that this world was not inhabited before he come here, you go back to Proverbs 8th chapter, and you will find that it was. It talks about when the sons of God used to come down on this earth and the habitable parts of the earth and play with the children of men. Get your Strong's Concordance out. 27 different types of men listed there. But it says that he was the deceiver of the whole habitable world, was thrown to the earth. Now he was corrupting another world, and he was thrown down here, and his angels with him, it says. In the 10th verse, and I heard a loud voice in heaven exclaiming, now has come the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah, who day and night accuses them before God, has been thrown out. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the fact of the evidence they have loved not their life better than death. 12th verse, exalt therefore, O heavens, you who are sheltered in them. My friends, if that's not somebody living in other worlds of outer space, then you tell me what it is. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has descended to you in great fury, knowing that his time is short. And I said, oh God, come quickly. Verse 13, and when the dragon found that he was thrown to the earth, he went in pursuit of the woman who gave birth to the man. Now this is talking about another allegory. Here he's coming down here, and you see, this is what I have said before, and people have never caught on. My friends, this war that's spoken of in Genesis 3:15, that talks about the war between the woman and the serpent, this started ages and eons and thousands of years ago in outer space, and it is to be culminated here on this planet. We're still at war. Most people aren't. They're just fat, dumb, and happy, and they'll go along in order to get along. But verse 15, from Fenton, and the serpent vomited water from his mouth like a river after the woman. My friends, that's another old allegory. Water is talking about racial streams that came out of his kingdom and went after the woman. And it's talking about the Semitic people of Adam here, so that she might be drowned in the stream. In other words, like the Chinese tried to flood us with a mass sea or great waves of people. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and sucked up the river and vomited from the mouth of the dragon. So the dragon was furious with the woman and proceeded to wage war with the rest of her offspring, those who observe the commands of God and cling to the evidence of Jesus. And he stationed himself on the sand of the sea. Now to review this just real quickly, the 9th verse tells of the accuser getting put out of Venus, or the Garden of Venus. We find the garden in Genesis. Her is called a habitable world, thrown down to earth. Verse 12, it tells of outer space and people who lived there. Verse 15 jumps centuries ahead to the serpent sending out a sea of people. And now verse 15, an idiot vomiting the water. We explained what that was. Now, we can understand Genesis 3:15 that talks about the enmity put between two seeds, or two different types of people. There's no end of scriptures which we could quote pertaining to the return of Christ in the air and the clouds coming with him and the vast armies of heaven or outer space. Nor shall, or have we forgotten all that leaving it to the reader here to search out, but we would like to quote Revelations 19:11-18. And for our Fenton, the church has trouble getting people to believe or understand these scriptures because the teacher, he's failed to look into the light of this 21st century technology that we have at our fingertips that could help us to understand what is presented here by John, speaking of spacesuits, sophisticated spaceships. And yet we've got to catch up with this. And I saw the heavens open. A white horse appeared, and its rider was called Faithful and True, for in justice he declares and wages war. And his eyes were like fiery flames, and upon his head he had many crowns, and having a name inscribed which none himself could understand, and was dressed in a robe sprinkled with blood, and his appointed title is, and so forth. Now, we have discussed in past chapters about windows, sometimes called doors of heaven, are open in outer space, and planets in perfect alignment for these space doors, and those that come from outer space to be able to land on our planet. Now, people of our nation, as well as others, they say that there is a certain date that the space shuttle's not to go up, and they have to wait until the conditions are just right for the planets and so forth. But horse here, as we've told you before, in the lost language, it meant Suez or an iron ship. And you know that as we went into what King David said about the great high hills of Bashan and so forth, and verse 12 speaks of his eyes as flames of fire, as he pointed out how the Egyptians spoke of the eye of Horus and there's spaceships that watch them, that visit them from time to time throughout the centuries. We've quoted from biblical scriptures where they're called watchers. Now we understand here that they are like flames of fires, and they can be turned into war ships of vengeance. Now when you get a cutting torch blue, then that's perfect fire, perfect flame. Now let us go to the 14th verse and finish what we started there. He said, the word of God and the armies in the heaven also followed him upon white horses, dressed in fine, pure white muslin, and he had a sharp sword drawn from a sheath. Now we just covered what sheath meant back there, and coming out of the house of God, and it goes on to say, so that he might smite the enemies, and he will govern them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of his fury, and the indignation of the all-ruling God. Upon his robes and upon his thigh were written the name, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now verse 14 tells of the extraterrestrial armies of outer space that are following the King of Israel. The idiom of the drawn swords means he's coming to make war with godless nations. Verse 17, he tells of the great slaughter of the nations, and he will war against the extraterrestrial armies. Verse 17, I saw a single angel stationed in the sun, and he shouted with a loud voice, calling to all the birds that fly in midair, come be collected for the great banquet of God, so that you may devour the flesh of kings. That's 17 and 18. But you notice where he said, standing in the sun. There, my friend, is the documented truth that I was telling you about, that Venus was also in ancient times referred to as a sun, a bright, shiny planet. That's why it was called Lucifer. It meant a radiant, shiny, bright, like a star, because the ancient people, they looked to the heavens and everything up there to them was a star. Now he goes on to tell about they will devour the flesh of commanders, and the flesh of the mighty, and the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all, both free and slaves, small and great, in the 19th verse. And I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth and their armies mustered to wage war against the rider upon the horse, and against his army, but the beast was overpowered with him, and the false prophet is talking about this false, sorry, milquetoast pseudo-religion that's been presented to the people. Going on with the rest of the 20th verse, who is in his sight, and it produced wonders which he deceived those who had received the brand of the beast, those who adored the image. These two were thrown into the fiery lake, burning with divine anger, and the remainder was slaughtered by the sword of the rider upon the horses, which he drew its sheath, and all of the birds was gorged upon their flesh. Now, verse 19 speaks of the beast system, meaning that he is unhappy with the way this world order is run, such as nations whose economy is based on drugs and so forth. And I think a big part of our economy is based on that too. And it talks about this false prophet and this false religions that are pleasing to this form of government. It talks about the whore that rides upon the beast. Maybe this world should be worried about its plan, and that many nations here where it talks about they're going to war, they're going to go to war with the outer space. Now, I believe we'll just leave it to that, but my final thought would be, when will these heavenly windows be opened? And will it not be soon, like Christ said, lest no flesh be saved? Now, we who are the sons and the daughters of the Most High, whether we live or die, that doesn't matter, because the New Testament, it says that we're counted as sheep all the day long for the slaughter. And Paul said, I don't reckon the suffering of this present time is worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. Us, the sons and daughters of the Most High, ever-living God. And we have the promise of the resurrection to put our faith and stock and hope in. And so, we would remind you once again, this Pilgrim Ships, P.O. Box 1086, Lakeview, Missouri 65737. Hopefully your friend Noah Fredericks, signing off. And pray that our nation shall once again turn back to God before there is blood on every doorstep.